Montana Territory, 1879, the unforgiving winter had finally relinquished its grip on the vast plains surrounding Whitehorn Creek. Thomas Everett stood on the weathered porch of his ranch house, squinting against the morning sun as it illuminated the distant Bitterroot Mountains. At 52, his face was etched with deep lines, each one a testament to years of struggle against this beautiful but merciless land. The Everett Ranch had once been among the most prosperous in the territory. But 3 consecutive years of drought had decimated his cattle herds. The final blow came last summer when Sarah, his wife of 27 years, succumbed to pneumonia. Now Thomas lived alone in the sprawling ranch house built for the family they never had. Sarah's inability to bear children had been their private sorrow, one they'd learned to live with over the decades of their marriage. Another day, Thomas muttered to himself, running calloused fingers through his salt and pepper beard. He had work to do, regardless of how empty the house felt or how pointless the labor sometimes seemed. The ranch hands had all moved. On when he could no longer pay decent wages, only old Pete remained, more out of loyalty than anything else. Thomas was about to head toward the stables when he spotted a cloud of dust on the horizon. Visitors were rare this far from town, and especially in the early morning hours. He watched as a wagon approached, driven by Hank Miller, the owner of the general store in Whitehorn. "Morning, Thomas," Hank called out as he pulled the wagon to a stop. "Got your supplies and mail?" He hesitated before adding, "There's something else you should know. The old Sullivan place finally sold." Thomas frowned. The Sullivan Ranch bordered his property to the east. It had been abandoned for nearly 3 years after old man Sullivan died without heirs. Who bought it? Fellow named Wilkes. Arrived from Chicago 2 weeks ago. Been staying at the hotel in town while getting his affairs in order. Hank's expression darkened, then brought a boy with him, young fella, maybe 16 or 17, skinny as a rail and jumpy as a jackrabbit, calls him an apprentice, but something ain't right there, Thomas. The boy's got bruises he can't explain, and Wilkes never lets him speak to anyone alone. Thomas felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same feeling he'd had years ago when he'd seen a horse being mistreated by its owner. What's being done about it?" Hank shrugged helplessly. "Sheriff Conway says there's nothing to do unless the boy makes a complaint, and Wilkes has papers, says the boy's indentured to him, legal-like after getting into trouble back east." After Hank left, Thomas couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. He'd heard stories of young men and even children being forced into what amounted to slavery under the guise of apprenticeships or indenture contracts. The practice had been declining since the Civil War, but it persisted in shadowy corners of American life. 2 days later, while repairing a fence line near the eastern boundary of his property, Thomas spotted a solitary figure working in the adjacent field. Even from a distance, he could tell it was a youth, struggling to clear heavy rocks from what would presumably become tillable land. The boy worked methodically but with obvious fatigue, occasionally stopping to wipe his brow or rub his lower back. Thomas watched for nearly an hour. Not once did anyone come to check on the boy or bring him water, despite the climbing temperature. Finally, Thomas filled a canteen and approached the property line. "Boy!" he called out. "Come get some water." The young man startled, nearly dropping the rock in his hands. He glanced nervously over his shoulder before setting down his burden and approaching cautiously, stopping several feet from the property boundary. Up close, Thomas could see that the youth was indeed desperately thin. His face was sunburnt and dirty, with dark circles under wary blue eyes. A faded bruise yellowed one cheekbone. "I shouldn't," the boy said in a low voice, though his gaze fixed hungrily on the canteen. "Your boss around?" Thomas asked, extending the water across the boundary line. After another nervous glance behind him, the boy quickly took the canteen and drank deeply. "Mr. Wilkes rode into town," he explained between gulps. Won't be back until sundown. What's your name, son? Daniel. Daniel Fletcher. I'm Thomas Everett. How long you been working for Wilkes? Daniel hesitated. Almost a year now, sir. And before that? Orphanage in Philadelphia. Mr. Wilkes said he'd teach me ranching and farming. Said after 5 years of service, I'd get a plot of land of my own. Daniel's eyes dropped to the ground. It hasn't exactly worked out that way. Before Thomas could respond, Daniel suddenly tensed. I hear horses. I have to get back to work. Thank you for the water, Mr. Everett. He thrust the canteen back into Thomas's hands and hurried away, resuming his labor with renewed vigor. Thomas retreated to his side of the property line just as 2 riders came into view. One was clearly Wilkes, a corpulent man with an expensive suit that strained against his girth. The other was a hired hand, rough-looking and armed with a pistol on his hip. Thomas nodded politely as they passed, but received only a suspicious glare in return. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. Sarah would have known what to do. She always had a way of sorting through complex problems with a clarity that eluded him. He could almost hear her voice. That boy needs help, Thomas, and God put you in a position to give it. Over the next 2 weeks, Thomas made a point of working near the boundary whenever possible. Sometimes he'd exchange a few words with Daniel. Other times, the boy was too closely supervised to risk communication. What Thomas learned disturbed him deeply. Daniel worked from dawn until dusk, 7 days a week. He slept in the barn, was fed barely enough to sustain him, and was beaten for any perceived infraction. The apprenticeship. The papers he'd signed at the orphanage had turned out to be a 5-year indenture contract, with terms that essentially made him Wilkes's property. One evening, as Thomas was finishing his solitary dinner, he heard frantic knocking at his door. He opened it to find Daniel, his face bloodied and his breathing ragged. "Please," the boy gasped. "He's going to kill me. I broke a plow." "Handle," and he went crazy. Thomas pulled Daniel inside just as the sound of horses approached. "Upstairs," he directed. "Second door on the right. Lock yourself in and stay quiet." Moments later, Wilkes and his hired man, a brute named Carver, pounded on Thomas's door. "Everett," Wilkes shouted, "my boy ran this way. You hiding him." Thomas stepped onto the porch, shotgun held casually but visibly at his side. "Haven't seen anyone," he replied evenly. "But I'd be interested to know why your apprentice would be running from you in the first place." Wilkes's face reddened. "That's none of your concern. The boy is legally bound to me, and I have the right to discipline him as I see fit." "No man has the right to beat another half to death," Thomas countered. "Not in this territory." "You are harboring my property," Wilkes spat. "I'll be back with the sheriff." After they left, Thomas went upstairs to find Daniel huddled in the corner of the guest bedroom, trembling. "He'll bring the sheriff," Daniel said, his voice quaking. "Are my papers illegal? They'll make me go back." Thomas sat on the edge of the bed. "Maybe, but first, I want to take a look at those papers, and I want the sheriff to see what Wilkes has been doing to you." He paused. "Daniel, would you be willing to testify against him, to tell the truth about how you've been treated?" The fear in Daniel's eyes was palpable. He said, "If I ever tried to leave or complained, he'd hunt me down." Said no one would believe an orphan troublemaker over a respected businessman. "I believe you," Thomas said simply. "And I think others will too." Sheriff Conway arrived the next morning with Wilkes in tow. The sheriff was a reasonable man whom Thomas had known for years, but he was also bound by the law. "Thomas," Conway began awkwardly, "Mr. Wilkes here has a legal claim on the boy. I need to see him." Thomas nodded and called for Daniel to come down. The boy descended the stairs slowly, his injuries from the previous day clearly visible in the morning light. The sheriff's expression hardened when he saw Daniel's condition. "Son," What happened to you?" Before Daniel could answer, Wilkes interjected, "The boy is clumsy. Fell off a ladder yesterday and then ran away rather than face consequences for breaking equipment." "That's not true," Daniel said quietly. "Mr. Wilkes beat me for breaking a plow handle. It's not the first time." Conway turned to Wilkes. "Let me see these indenture papers you mentioned." Wilkes produced a folded document from his jacket. The sheriff read it carefully, his frown deepening. "This gives you the right to the boy's labor in exchange for training, room, board, and education. It doesn't give you the right to abuse him. I've provided everything that contract requires," Wilkes insisted. "The boy is being dramatic." "Then you won't mind if Daniel stays here while we sort this out," Thomas suggested. "Just for a few days, until we can get a judge to review the situation." Wilkes's face contorted with rage. "Absolutely not. The boy is coming with me now." "Actually," Sheriff Conway said, "I think Thomas's suggestion is reasonable. Daniel will remain here until Judge Patterson arrives for circuit court next week." He turned to Wilkes. "And if I find evidence that you've been mistreating this boy beyond what's allowed in your contract, you'll face charges." After Wilkes stormed off and the sheriff departed, a visible weight seemed to lift from Daniel's shoulders. "And you really think the judge might void my contract?" he asked Thomas. "I don't know," Thomas answered honestly, "but we're going to find out." The days that followed were transformative for both Thomas and Daniel. Having someone else in the house again breathed life into spaces that had grown stale with loneliness. Daniel proved to be an eager worker with a quick mind. He helped Thomas with the ranch chores, soaking up knowledge about cattle, horses, and land management with remarkable enthusiasm. "You've got a natural gift with the animals," Thomas observed one evening as they finished dinner. Daniel had spent the afternoon helping to train a particularly stubborn young horse, displaying a patience that impressed even old Pete. Daniel smiled, a genuine expression that Thomas had rarely seen from the boy. "I always loved animals. At the orphanage, I used to sneak out to pet the carriage horses on the street." His smile faded. "That's actually how Wilkes found me. I was admiring his horse outside a hotel, and he offered me apprenticeship on his ranch. Said I had a good touch with horses. He wasn't wrong about that," Thomas said, "just about everything else." As the days passed, Thomas found himself growing increasingly attached to Daniel. The boy's resilience and optimistic nature, despite everything he'd endured, reminded Thomas of himself at that age, and Daniel seemed to flourish under Thomas's guidance, gaining weight and confidence with each passing day. The morning Judge Patterson was due to arrive in Whitehorn, Thomas found Daniel sitting on the porch steps, staring anxiously toward town. "What if the judge sides with Wilkes?" Daniel asked without preamble. Thomas sat beside him. "Then we'll appeal, and if that doesn't work, we'll find another way." Daniel looked at him in surprise. "You'd do that for me? Why?" Thomas was silent for a long moment. "Because everyone deserves a chance at a real life, Daniel. Not just survival, but a life with purpose and dignity." He cleared his throat awkwardly. "And because this old ranch could use some young blood, if you wanted to stay on, that is, learn the business properly." Daniel's eyes widened. "You mean, even if the judge frees me from the contract?" "Especially then," Thomas confirmed. "You'd be here by choice, not obligation. I can't offer much in wages yet, but you'd have a home, good food, and honest work. And someday, if you're interested, maybe more than that." Daniel nodded, swallowing hard. "I'd like that very much, Mr. Everett." The courtroom in Cheekil, Whitehorn, was packed when Judge Patterson heard the case. Wilkes had hired a lawyer from Helena who argued vehemently that the indenture contract was binding and that Daniel's claims of mistreatment were exaggerated attempts to escape his legal Obligations. When Daniel's turn came to testify, he spoke clearly about the conditions he'd endured: 18-hour workdays, insufficient food, sleeping in an unheated barn through the Montana winter, and regular beatings for minor infractions. Thomas testified about Daniel's injuries and the boy's terrified state when he sought refuge. The turning point came when Sheriff Conway produced statements from 3 other young men who had previously been apprenticed to Wilkes in different territories. All 3 described similar patterns of abuse and exploitation before they had managed to escape. Judge Patterson was a stern man with a reputation for strict adherence to the law, but also for fundamental fairness. His verdict was unequivocal. "This contract," he announced, holding up the document, while technically legal in form, "has been so thoroughly violated in substance by Mr. Wilkes that I hereby declare it null and void. Daniel Fletcher is released from any obligation to Isaiah Wilkes." He turned his steely gaze to Wilkes. "Furthermore, I am forwarding evidence of your treatment of these young men to federal authorities. I suggest you leave this territory promptly." Outside the courthouse, Daniel could barely contain his elation. "I'm free," he kept saying. "Really free." Thomas smiled, feeling a lightness he hadn't experienced since before Sarah's illness. "Yes, you are. Free to choose your own path." Daniel looked at him earnestly. "I've already chosen. If your offer still stands, Mr. Everett, I'd like to learn ranching from you, the right way." 6 months later, the Everett Ranch was showing signs of revival. With Daniel's help and some innovative approaches the boy had learned from books ordered from back east, they'd managed to increase their cattle yields and even experiment with new crops better suited to the challenging Montana climate. Thomas had officially hired Daniel as his assistant ranch manager, with a fair wage and a small percentage of the profits. One crisp fall evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and in purple, Daniel broached a subject they'd danced around for months. "Mr. Everett," he began hesitantly, "I've been thinking about something." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Oh? I know you and Mrs. Everett never had children of your own," Daniel continued cautiously. "And I never knew my parents. They died when I was just a baby." Thomas felt his heart quicken. "Go on." "Well, I was wondering. That is, if you thought it might be appropriate. If you might consider—" Daniel took a deep breath. "But would you consider adopting me legally? I mean, I know I'm almost 18, but—" "Yes," Thomas interrupted, his voice thick with emotion. "Nothing would make me prouder than to call you my son." Daniel's face broke into a radiant smile. "Well, really, you mean it?" Thomas nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Finally, he managed, "Your mother would have loved you, Daniel. Sarah always had a special place in her heart for strays, human or animal, that needed a home." "Tell me about her," Daniel requested, settling back in his chair. "I wish I could have known her." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Thomas shared stories of Sarah, her kindness, her strength, her unwavering faith that everything happened for a reason. For the first time, the memories brought more comfort than pain. Later that night, as Thomas prepared for bed, he paused before the photograph of Sarah on his nightstand. "You were right, my love," he whispered. "God did put me in position to help that boy. What I didn't realize was that he also put that boy in position to help me." The following spring, the Everett Ranch hosted its first cattle auction. In 4 years, ranchers from across the territory came to bid on the exceptionally healthy stock that Thomas and Daniel had raised. The event was a resounding success, putting the ranch firmly back on the path to prosperity. As the last buyers departed, Daniel, now officially Daniel Everett, joined Thomas on the hilltop overlooking the ranch house and surrounding pastures. "We did it," Daniel said proudly. "The Everett Ranch is back." Thomas nodded, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder. Not just back, better than before. They stood in companionable silence, watching the sunset. Thomas reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought them together. A year ago, he had been a lonely widower watching his life's work crumble around him, while Daniel had been trapped in a nightmare of exploitation and abuse. Now, against all odds, they had become a family, bringing healing and purpose to each other's lives. "You know," Thomas said thoughtfully, "your mother always used to say that the greatest courage isn't facing danger, but facing tomorrow with hope when today has been filled with sorrow." Daniel nodded. "And she sounds like she was very wise." "She was," Thomas agreed, "and she would be so proud of the man you're becoming." As they walked back toward the house together, the first stars appearing in the twilight sky, Thomas felt a profound sense of gratitude. The barren years, both of the land and of his heart, were finally over. In saving Daniel, he had somehow saved himself as well, discovering that it's never too late for a new beginning. The legacy of the Everett Ranch would continue, not through blood, but through something perhaps even stronger. The bond forged between two souls who had found in each other exactly what they needed most. A chance to belong, to matter, to build something lasting together. In the years that followed, the story of Thomas and Daniel Everett became something of a legend in Whitehorn and beyond, a testament to the power of compassion and the enduring truth that family is defined, not by birth but by love. As for Isaiah Wilkes, he fled Montana Territory ahead of federal investigators, but his past eventually caught up with him in Wyoming. Convicted of fraud and multiple counts of abuse, he spent his remaining years in prison, his empire of exploitation finally crumbling to dust. And on the rolling plains near the Bitterroot Mountains, the Everett Ranch flourished under the care of a father and son who had found each other against all odds, transforming a tale of cruelty and despair into one of redemption and hope, proving that even in the harshest wilderness, the human spirit can find a way to not just survive, but to truly thrive.